This episode of Storyophonic is sponsored by SESAC, a performing rights organization that represents the world's top songwriters, composers, and music publishers. And by Universal Audio, pioneering audio recording for more than 60 years. Welcome to the digital airways of Storyophonic, an ongoing conversation series presenting the people, personalities, and perspectives of the modern music business. I'm Dan Kimpel. With our fourth season, we continue to introduce you to those in the spotlight and behind the scenes, and all of our Storyophonic subjects are right here with us in person. It is our objective to entertain and inform you as we reveal tips and tales from deep inside the music industry. Christophe Beck is one of Hollywood's foremost composers. Now, with the release of Frozen 2, the Canadian-born, Los Angeles-based Beck expands the Frozen Disney soundscapes for Elsa and her cohorts.
The power of music to transform a scene one way or another was so intoxicating that it was a really transformational moment for me. And it was kind of a moment for me when I thought, okay, this is something I can do for the rest of my life. It's that powerful a feeling. I want to give these students that feeling. I want them to experience what I experienced and to understand that, there's a world out there beyond pop music. There's a world out there beyond producing or beat making. And it's an incredibly wonderful and rewarding world. If you work hard and have a little bit of luck, can be a great way to make a living as well.
From the Hangover Trilogy to the Peanuts movie, he explores a remarkable compositional range with powerful emotion and soul. Cue in Christophe Beck. Welcome, Storyophonic listeners. It's a smoky day in Los Angeles.
Indeed.
We took the scenic route over from the valley to beautiful Santa Monica, California. We are in the presence and the studio of Christophe Beck. Chris, so great to see you.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
It's a great timing. You're having a busy month. There's a little opening happening a little later on in this month, I believe, that you'll probably be attending.
Yes.
And that's Frozen 2.
That's Frozen 2. In fact, there's a wrap party for the crew, the hundreds of people that worked on the film for many, many years. And then a week later, the official red carpet premiere, both of which I'm very much looking forward to.
So much expectation around it. Frozen 1 set all kinds of records in terms of box office. But more than that, it became a cultural touchstone, especially for a lot of kids.
It did. Yeah. And I'm extremely proud of it. It took us all by surprise. When I was first brought on to consider doing the music for Frozen, for Disney to consider me, it was my first opportunity to do a Disney animated feature. And it's kind of a composer's dream to do a film like that. At least it was for me. At the beginning of my career, seeing all the great Alan Menken scored movies and thinking, one day, if I'm lucky, I'll get to do that. And I remember seeing a very early cut of the film. And one of the things that's interesting about animated films in general, and I've learned this since Frozen, I've done quite a few others, is that they tend to come together at the last minute. So if you see an early cut, it can be a bit of a rough experience. And I remember seeing it, and Wreck-It Ralph had just come out, and I saw a very early cut of Frozen. And this was before they solved some key problems. And I remember thinking to myself, why couldn't my first Disney movie have been Wreck-It Ralph? Why do I have to do this princess movie for little girls, And of course, I had no idea, because it was my first one, that it would come together in the way that it did. And of course, none of us had any idea that it would become as successful as it did. And I'm extremely proud of the film and the score, and very proud to have been associated with it. In fact, I can sort of look back and think in terms of my career as my career before Frozen and my career afterward.
Without giving away too much, what can we expect musically? You now have a legacy with the characters, so there's the question of, how much reference point is that from the past, or how much is new information?
That's a great question. In fact, it's the question whenever, as a composer or in any other department on a film, you take on the task of making a sequel, which is finding that balance between the familiar and the new. And the filmmakers definitely, when I first was brought on to Frozen 2, wanted to go for a more mature, more epic, more deep and meaningful feel. And this is reflected in the first couple of trailers. In fact, the very first trailer was a scene with Elsa on a beach, and it was very dark and it was stormy, and it felt different and new. And when I first started working on it, that was kind of my mantra, to do a deeper, more meaningful, more mature score. In fact, I took it a little bit too much to heart, and we realized at a certain part in the process, I worked on it on and off for about 6 months. And about halfway through, we kind of realized we were maybe going a little too far that way. And maybe the film itself was going a little too far that way as well. So we kind of took a step back and revisited some key spots. In particular, the very first thing you hear in the movie, without giving it too much away, although it is the first thing you hear. So I don't know how horrible a sin it would be to give it away. Let's just say that, the first thing you see is the very familiar Walt Disney logo and the Mickey Mouse Walt Disney Animation logo, and you hear some very specific callbacks musically to some of the most iconic music in the first film. So we kind of start off on that foot, sort of saying, you know what, we're going to try to do something new here, but we want to remind you, the audience, that this is still going to be Anna and Elsa, the characters you love, and Olaf and the gang, and don't be too concerned or anxious that we're taking this to a completely new place, because it really is the same characters and the same central theme of sisterly bond and the relationship between these two sisters. So once we established that part, then we felt more free during the rest of the movie to go further afield. And one of the things I really wanted to do in this film was spend time on crafting some new themes. There are a couple of key themes from the first film that I bring back. There are a couple of references to even some songs from the first film that I bring back, but mostly I focused on 3 central new themes. One being for the bond between the two sisters, another one being for Elsa, a new theme for Elsa because this movie is really about Elsa's journey and her intense internal desire to find out who she is, how she became who she is, with the source of her powers. And so I wanted to come up with a theme that had a little bit of more grounding in it, that was a little bit heroic, but really had even a little bit of longing in it. And then a third theme for the forest people called the Northuldra in the film, which is where much of it takes place.
That's interesting culturally when you talk about those elements. And I know with the first movie, there are elements that you used of indigenous music, Sami music it's called.
That's right.
Right, and there's certain elements of that, including instruments. There's a horn.
There's a bouquet horn.
Yes, exactly.
That's right, which is used to, I believe, to herd goats.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a kind of a yodeling called kulning that was used in the score in the first film. And that was very inspirational to the writers of the second film. And it became a story point, actually. In the film, I don't think it's giving too much away to say that Elsa hears voices calling to her. It's kind of a siren call. And that became a part of the story. So it's not really a part of the score because we really wanted to keep it kind of clean and separate. Mm-hmm. And it's not really kulning specifically. It's more ethereal, exotic type of a sound that is less geographically specific. But that carried through from the first film. And I also used a type of bone flute called a gem's horn. This is a new sound for Frozen 2 that is more associated with the Northuldra, the forest people. It's a very magical and mystical place. If you or any of your listeners are familiar with an ocarina, it is a kind of giant ocarina played by the very talented Chris Beck.
Now, the coding is interesting because I understand it's sometimes used to call livestock in the mountains.
That's right. So I think you just compared Elsa to livestock.
Sorry, Elsa.
But yes, exactly.
It's so terrific. Obviously, you get to work with a big orchestra,
In fact, the biggest of my career, this one.
How
it was
big?
90 pieces, and at times, a choir of an additional 40 voices. So in terms of raw resources, I appreciate very much Disney's approach to providing these resources for their composers. Anything I asked for, they were happy to let me try. And so I thought, you know what? We're going to go big. Let's go big.
Los Angeles is home to so many amazing vocalists that
Very much so.
enrich scores, and
Yes.
it's a great community of people.
And I'll tell you where else is a great resource for a great vocalist is Norway. The choir that sang the Hey Na Na music in the first film is called Cantus, and they're based in Trondheim in the northern part of Norway. They became associated with the first film almost by chance, but have since become very strongly associated. That particular sound and that particular piece, which was composed by a composer from the area named Frode, and I'm going to butcher his last name, Frodenheim. So we reached out to them again and worked with them again to do a couple of new versions of the classic Hey Na Na music, as well as a new piece that he and I co-wrote. And that's also 30 voices. So sometimes you got the 90 pieces plus the LA choir, which is more of a traditional classical sound, and sometimes it's the 90 pieces plus the 30 voices from Norway.
No overkill there. That's great. That's great. That's so great. Chris Buck, who's one of the directors of the film, is he a musical guy?
Well, he may be. I am very pleased to report that he's not sitting me down and saying, you know what, this C sharp here, could we try a C natural? I've always believed, and I'm sure you'll find most of my colleagues agree, that the most fruitful way to collaborate with the composer as a filmmaker is to speak in emotional and storytelling terms and let the composers do the interpreting into the actual notes on the page. And so I'm also very pleased to report that both Chris Buck, and by the way, I just realized on this film we have a Chris Buck director, a Chris Beck composer, and a Chris Bleth Gems horn player. So there's a lot of Chris B's. Both Chris Buck and Jen Lee, the co-directors, are the most thoughtful and respectful and enjoyable collaborators to work with in my entire career. They really gave me the latitude to come up with ideas whenever I had maybe an idea that was a bit left of center or a little bit crazy, or even in situations where they already knew what they wanted. And before they could even articulate it to me, I came to them and said, here's my idea. And it was 180 degrees from what they were thinking. They were always ready to listen and had an open mind. And I find that's true in most animation situations. I think the folks who are making these movies as directors, they come up through the ranks. They're basically nerds, and they understand the process because they start out as story editors or software engineers or specialists in hair animation or whatever it is. So they understand how to work with the hundreds of people that it takes to make a movie like this. And as a result, I feel like the collaborations from a composing perspective are just incredibly rewarding artistically.
Viewing the timeline, I kind of reviewed the timeline of the first Frozen movie and was reading about the length of time and the processes it took to take. Essentially, was inspired by a Hans Christian Andersen story, and
right, loosely.
Yeah, very loosely. As time went on, it became a whole other thing. It's interesting to see the timeline for this film, Chris. At what point did you become involved in creating musical sketches? Were you involved over a long period of time?
Compared to live action, definitely. Yeah. Most animated films take such a long time to put together that the composer is brought on relatively early in the process. Basically, as soon as there are scenes that are locked, the way an animated film is put together is kind of scene by scene, and they may still be working on big chunks of the story. They may still be shifting around scenes, adding characters, eliminating characters, but hopefully at a certain point, kind of early in the process, and by this I mean, in the case of Frozen 2, about 6 months before we recorded, there are some scenes that they know are going to be in the movie and that they have sort of sicked the artists on, and they have begun putting those scenes through the pipeline. So that about 6 months before I started recording Frozen 2, I started getting my first scenes. And by then I had my themes all ready to go. I could dive into the scenes as they appeared. So it might take 3, 4, 5 years to make an animated film, but my part is the last 6 months.
Oh, cool.
To a year in other situations. I believe the Peanuts movie I was on and off for about a year. It'd be about 6 months to a year.
You did music to a short, kind of a prelude, which was Paper Man. A very cool project.
I love it myself.
Did that open up the Disney world to you?
That's exactly how that happened. Yeah. John Carrs, a friend of mine, directed that film, and God bless him, was a fan of my music and requested that I come in to talk to him about doing the music. And this was my first ever project with Disney Animation. I in many ways owe it all to him. My working on Frozen 2 and, just probably all the other animated films that I have done or will do. And it was, you've seen it, and maybe many in your audience have seen it.
Yeah.
It's in black and white. There's no dialogue. It's really a composer's showpiece. And much to my delight, even though it appeared to be set in a kind of vague 50s, 60s Art Deco black and white style, it had a real retro feel to it. I believe the faces and hands were hand-drawn, but the rest of it was computer-generated, and that was a real innovation at the time to combine these two techniques. So you have the expressiveness of traditional, 2D hand-drawn animation with the possibilities with camera movement and lighting that 3D computer-generated animation gives you. And the music was anachronistic. It was very contemporary. So it was just an amazing opportunity to do that. And it was immediately after that project that they called me in to look at Frozen.
Storytelling, so you get to tell the story because there is no dialogue.
It's like a silent movie.
So storytelling, I believe, is something that you've always been attracted to. As I understand, it was your first thing. It was you wanted to compose for Broadway.
That's right. Yeah. So I think the two things that really make me a good fit for this career are a desire to, if I were to be less generous, I would say it's something to hide behind, It's like, I want to present my music to the world. I want to express myself musically, but by being part of something bigger, it's a way of, again, less generously abdicating responsibility, or more generously, if you prefer, feeling like part of a bigger storytelling team and feeling like you're a part of something bigger than just writing a piece of music. And then the other thing that makes me a good fit for this is the deadlines. If I didn't have a deadline, I don't think I'd finish anything. And even thinking back to my college days when I decided to write with my roommate who wrote the libretto, an opera based on Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, I remember procrastinating until I put down the deposit on the performance space. And then I had like 2 months to finish it. So once I had that deadline, I realized I had better start writing. And it very closely mirrors the process that I go through professionally, year in, year out in this business, where I'm given some parameters to work with. In the case of the Edgar Allan Poe story, it's the libretto and it's the short story itself. These days, it's the film and the story and direction from the people who are essentially in charge, the director or directors, as in the case with Frozen 2. And, also it has to be done by this day. I think I need those two things to be creative. I'm not sure what I would do with myself if I just sat down to make an abstract piece of music, to just express myself in pure musical terms with no deadline. Maybe someday.
For those listeners that don't know, you're originally from Canada. Mm-hmm. You're one of the mean Canadians who comes over to and excels in the industry. We have a lot of Canadian folks here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm a total douchebag, eh?
I say mean Canadians with a
of course,
because Canadians are such lovely people.
Yeah. Or pushovers.
Well, there's that. Yeah. You went to USC, and that's definitely a part of the upbringing. There are a number of composers that excel in various parts of our industry who were your contemporaries, who you came up with, and you also came up with directors at USC as well.
That's right.
It must have been an amazing time to be there.
It was an amazing time. It was pretty much in its infancy at the time. In the early 90s, it was the only program of its kind. I believe now there are quite a few, some excellent ones too. But USC is still, I believe, among the top. Marco Beltrami, I went to school with. He and I both were in Jerry Goldsmith's class. And in fact, Marco and I partnered up on a number of projects early in our respective careers. He had some pretty good connections and, of course, a monster talent. and I had a studio and the know-how and experience to use it. So he would get an opportunity for a job, and he would come to me and say, hey, I've got this opportunity for a job. Let's collaborate. We call ourselves Beck Beltrami. And what was funny is I believe we ended up doing 4 or 5 jobs together. And I think on all but one, I ended up getting fired, and he would decide to keep going without me. So it was a kind of, funny. Maybe at the time it wasn't so funny, but looking back on it now, it's definitely worth a laugh. And I learned my lesson. I'm like, hey, this isn't really working for me. I keep getting fired. What's with that? We're still very good friends. I have enormous respect for him, and we see each other fairly often. And I have to say, it's really fun to have a good friend that we basically start our careers together, to find ourselves, in the respective positions that we're in today.
In an earlier era of composers, the composers tended to be pigeonholed greatly.
Yes.
There was a time when somebody who did television
Yes.
just did television, somebody who just did films, somebody did games didn't exist,
Yep.
or advertising. Obviously, that's changed over time. But when I first met you, and the first time I ever interviewed you, that's when you were doing TV,
Yeah.
and you were doing big TV. You did Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Practice, and there was a third.
Those were the two
that I
big
remember,
ones. And
yeah.
the reasons why those are the two that stick in my mind is those are the two I was working on when I decided to quit them both at the same time. And I remember my agent thought I was crazy. Here I was on 2 amazing shows. They were amazing for different reasons. Buffy was amazing creatively in the sense that the themes were big. Of course, it was all, inside the box, as we say, meaning all done electronically, but, sweeping orchestral scores with big themes that carried through seasons. It was amazing training ground for symphonic film composing. And a legal thriller, The Practice, I should say drama, The Practice, which, had maybe 5-6 minutes of very minimal music every week. In other words, a very easy gig. So I had, 2 very creatively rewarding gigs. And one of them was something that I always was interested in, which is the symphonic writing. And the other one was just something that it went incredibly smoothly week to week. And I quit them both at the same time because, as you correctly pointed out, the landscape was different then than it is now. Yeah. Now there's so much great work being done in television. It has a certain respect that TV really didn't have back then. And if you were vying to get a job on a film and you showed up with a bunch of TV credits, there would be a certain snobbery there, and they would kind of look down on you and think, oh, that's not somebody we can hire. That person's a TV composer. I think these days, if you walk in, with some of the shows that are on cable now that are amazing on your resume, I think that commands you a lot of respect anywhere you go. That was not the case back then. So I made a decision to kind of reboot or restart my career as a film composer. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I had confidence in myself that I would be able to do it. I knew it would take maybe a little bit of time, and it did. It took a couple of years before things really started rolling, but I think that was a really important milestone in my career.
One of the moments when I became aware of kind of how your career had accelerated was Under the Tuscan Sun, and that film. It's a lovely, beautiful, very acoustic sounding instruments.
Thank you.
It really holds up beautifully.
Thank you.
How do you remember it?
Well, I remember it extremely fondly and a little bit bittersweetly as well, because the director and writer of that film, Audrey Wells, passed away last year. Anyone who met her fell in love with her and felt like she fell in love with them. She's just one of those incredibly warm and giving and inviting people to be around. And that was our second collaboration together. That was only her second film that she directed. The first film we did together was Guinevere, and Guinevere and Under the Tuscan Sun, I feel, are 2 of the highlights of my career, 2 of my favorite scores. And I was, I always knew in the back of my mind up until a year ago that there would be another one, and always looked forward to it because I knew it would be some of my best work again, just because she found a way to bring that out in me. So obviously that's not going to happen now, But I'm extremely proud of those two scores. And Under the Tuscan Sun in particular, because we had the orchestra available to us and because it was such a touching and warm story, and the score was, creatively speaking for me, something of a discovery, of a way to write minimalistically but still beautifully that I still carry with me to this day.
Speaking of touching and warm, the Hangover Trilogy.
Of course, yes. Different kind of touching.
It's one thing, I think, to develop a musical storyline over one film, but you're developing a musical storyline over 3 films,
Right. And I think the scores mirror the journey that those films took as well. The first film, sort of like what we were talking about earlier with Frozen, took all of us by surprise how successful it was. I knew while working on it that it was something special and that it was funny and felt new and a little bit different from anything we'd seen before. But you never know when you're working on a film. And I see a movie so many times when I'm working on it that it doesn't take long for my experience of the movie to become one of problem solving and less one of watching the film as a regular audience member would. So I lose all objectivity very early on about whether the film I'm working on is even any good or not. I'm just there to do my job and do it as best I can. It took us all by surprise and was this huge hit. And I think, we all maybe made a little mistake with the second one, treading that same ground a little too closely. I think a lot of people who saw that second one felt like it was really kind of a retread of the first one with different jokes. I personally very much enjoyed the second one and was surprised at the critical reaction it got. And I think the same could be said of the score. It's sort of like the same score of the first one. The film is set in Thailand as opposed to Vegas. So it has that sonic signature of the Far East with more exotic instruments. But it is essentially the same kind of contemporary detective story type of score. Where's Doug? Now for the third one, we decided to go in a totally different direction, both in terms of the story and the music. And Todd Phillips, the director, wanted to make a definitive move away from the formula of the first two and made a kind of epic operatic crime thriller featuring Chow and wanted the music to follow suit. So for that one, we got an orchestra and a choir, and the music is much more suitably epic and, whenever possible, as big as we could make it.
You mentioned Peanuts earlier, and I read reference that you kind of wanted to do it as if he had grown up in the era when you grew up. Was that the approach?
I think the way I put it was, what if Vince Guaraldi had grown up in the 80s listening to New Order and Depeche Mode and Styx, the way I did. And that was a very interesting process for me. I got very excited at the beginning to sort of channel Vince Guaraldi as a child of the 80s pop scene, and wrote a suite of small ensemble piano-based pieces, but a little bit less jazz influence, a little bit more pop. I have memories of being a kid in middle school and being really jealous of the piano-playing kid who could go up to the piano and go do 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 do, and impress all the girls or whatever. And I thought, I want to make a suite of piano-centric pieces that the kid in middle school today can learn easily, maybe with a little bit of practice, and have it sound really impressive when they sit down and play it. So I wrote 8 pieces like this, and I spent a lot of time on them. And honestly, some of the best work in my career, I believe. And we started putting it in the movie, and it was like a revelation. It was like, oh my God, this is so Peanuts. This is amazing. And then they started testing the movie, and they found that the movie had pacing issues. I think we all fell in love a little bit too much with the idea of making the Christmas special again. And we all grew up with that Christmas special that was made in the 60s. But if you look at it today with contemporary viewers' eyes, it's very deliberately paced. There's a lot of very, very heady, philosophical dialogue. There's not a lot of cutting. It's something we all grew up with and we loved, but not something you can make 2 hours of and put in front of a contemporary audience and expect it to succeed. And I think we kind of came to that realization all together, not only with the picture, but also with the music. So slowly but surely, and I was on this film for about a year, so it was really quite slowly but surely, those piano pieces gave way to more contemporary animation scoring with orchestra, with an emphasis on the comedy and pacing. And so rather than try to channel my own version of Vince Guaraldi and make a whole score based out of that, it became a more traditional symphonic score with more direct references to those classic Vince Guaraldi tunes. So in a few places, you will hear that Linus and Lucy theme come in, and the other famous Christmas music, skating. I'm singing it horribly, but there's a piano over there. I could go over there and probably play it just as horribly as I just sang it. But to have more direct references to those Vince Guaraldi tunes and let that give us our nostalgia, just by, I think as the director put it, sort of like a plane flying across this journey, every once in a while just touching down and like reminding the audience that there's this, great musical tradition, that we remind them that we still know and love it, and give it to them in small doses, as opposed to going whole hog with the languid piano music.
Your ability to enter into these totemic universes is interesting. We see you in the Marvel universe. You can do Ant-Man, and that also is used a certain retro point of reference for Ant-Man. Is that correct?
Yes, the first film was very much a heist movie, and so I was able to tap into those classic heist movie sounds: vibraphone, alto flute, percussion, Latin percussion like bongos, the whole Lalo Schifrin Mission Impossible school of heist and spy movie scoring. And I think that was a great thing, because it enabled me to give this Marvel hero its own unique spin, especially within the themes of the Marvel universe. So I was really grateful to have that hook into a superhero score.
We're in your writing room, and there's interesting tools about.
Yeah.
We see a Wurlitzer behind us, kind of very low tech. We see a very terrifying wall of synthesizers, and I know you're a big fan of modular synths.
That's right. That's what's behind me to my back. I don't want to turn around and face it, or I might get scared myself. It is pretty big.
It's big.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what they are.
That's what they are, and I love these instruments. I can get lost in them for hours at a time. I've been busy lately, so I haven't had much time with it. But, a few years ago, I took 6 months off from scoring to recharge my batteries, and I spent a lot of time with modular synths. And I would sometimes, finish my day job at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. and think, I think I'll just tinker around for a couple hours before I go home. The next thing I know, I'm getting a phone call saying, hey, it's breakfast time. Are you coming home? It's really the type of thing that invites experimentation and allows me to lose myself in music making in a way that I really haven't experienced since, my teenage years, when I was just discovering the joys of music making. It's really intoxicating to play with those instruments for me. They don't lend themselves terrifically well to film scoring, because film scoring is about repeatability and versions and being able to present music to your collaborators and have them say, I like this, but maybe can we hear what you did 2 versions ago? Maybe I like that better. And, okay, give me a week to plug in these cables the way I had them before and adjust all these knobs. And, honestly, sometimes when I have a patch set up here, the knobs are so sensitive, and the tiniest twist of the knob has a radical effect on the sound. That's what makes it great. It kind of has a mind of its own sometimes. It's really just impossible to repeat it. I sometimes believe if you breathe on a knob the wrong way, you might, accidentally change the sound. So the way to use this instrument in scoring, and the way I've kind of developed, is to just have my computer ready to record whatever sounds come out of it. And as soon as the sounds that come out of it start to become interesting, and that's one of the beauties of the instrument, is you never know when that's going to happen. It's pretty much the definition of happy accidents, to just document it from an audio perspective. And what I've done is I've built a large library of synth sounds that come from this instrument and, the Wurlitzer. You neglected to mention, all the crazy pedals that are sitting on top of the Wurlitzer.
Yeah.
For me, that kind of experimental noise making is really, really fun. And whenever I can, I try to explore that part of my musical expression. And I have a library of all this cool stuff. And when I get to do a more electronic score, for example, most recently, I have a documentary out this weekend, in fact, called Watson, which is about Captain Paul Watson. He is a self-described eco-pirate, and he is a pretty intense whale conservationist, one of the founding members of Greenpeace, who was kicked out of Greenpeace for being too radical. Yeah. That was directed by the very lovely Leslie Chilcott. And that was an electronic score with a lot of kind of pseudo underwater textures. I was able to pull a lot of sounds from my library that came from the modular synth to make that score. And it's not quite the same experience as sitting down with 20 cables wrapped around my neck and start plugging into holes saying, well, what'll happen if I do this? And what'll happen if I twist this? But it's pretty much the only way I can incorporate those sounds into my scores. And it was very satisfying to do that.
Good. Anon was an electronic score.
I was going to mention Anon as well, the Netflix film with
Yes.
Clive Owen, directed by Andrew Niccol. That's more of a film noir set in the future type of a vibe, and a little more experimental, and therefore gave me a chance to do something I rarely get to do, which is get crazy with the electronics. And there's a whole section of my library of wacky sounds that I just couldn't put in just about any film score. But that one had room for some of those things.
We get to interview people across a really wide dynamic here at Stereophonic, and we love composer interviews. We've done a number of interviews with women composers, and we love women. There's been a wonderful movement within our industry of women now doing major films, women doing action films, Pinar Toprick kind of going into the Marvel universe. And I know this is something that's important to you. You have a couple of initiatives to expand diversity within the composing community. And can you talk a little bit about that, too?
Absolutely. I think you're being a little generous to call it a movement. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're seeing a trickle in the right direction. I mean, for years, I've been aware that I have been the unfair beneficiary of my industry's penchant towards hiring white dudes. And I referred earlier to the 6 months that I took off to recharge my batteries. And it was during the 6 months when I was, in between all night knob twiddling sessions on my synth. And I was trying to figure out, what else can I do with my time while I take a break? And I thought to myself, well, I've always been aware that my industry is not one of the more diverse segments of this film industry that I have owed my career and lifestyle to. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more appalling it seemed. It's a little bit better now, but if you made a list of the top 100 media composers in film, TV, and games, you would find probably well over 80, 85, 90 of them are white guys. And 5-6 years ago when I first started thinking about this, the number was maybe 97 or 98. It was right around the time of the, hashtag Oscars so white, all that stuff with not only talent in front of the camera, but behind the camera. And then I thought, you know what? Everyone's complaining about all these, segments of the film industry, but we're the worst, truly. Always thought to myself, if I ever had the time and money, maybe I could do something about it. And suddenly I found myself with 6 months off. And, Frozen had just come out and sold however many millions of records. So time to put my money and time where my mouth is. And I talked to a lot of people and kind of honed in on two approaches to tackling this problem. One of the problems is that young composers, especially composers of color and female composers, talking like high school, they know they're talented. They know they want a career doing music. And it may not even occur to them that film music is an option. And there are very few composers that look like them doing it. And so it just doesn't even occur to them that that's something they might want to do, when in fact they might be a great fit for the industry, and the industry might benefit greatly from their musical voice, their artistic voice. So I have been teaching high school students. I started out a few years ago at Centennial High in Compton, and I'm working later this year with the Fauché Academy, very near USC, my alma mater, to work with high school kids and to expose them to the industry and do exercises with them, show them how rewarding it can be to be part of that storytelling team. I remember the first time I put music to picture. I never really considered it as a career till I came out here and did the USC program. And before the program started, I bought the equipment that I needed, which at the time was a keyboard and a VHS player and a TV. And I remember I was watching Die Hard with Bruce Willis with my roommates at the time in the week before the USC program was about to start. And we came upon a scene where he walks across a room barefoot over broken glass. And it's kind of an excruciating scene to watch. It's a famous scene from this film. And I had no experience thinking about film music at the time, but I knew enough to realize that there was no music in this scene, and that was maybe an interesting choice. And of course, now that I have all this experience doing all these movies, I know that it is a bold choice to let sound effects play a scene like that and let the reality of it sink into the viewer in a way that is extremely effective. But at the time, I'm like, hey, what would it be like if I just turned on my keyboard, rewind to the beginning of the scene, and just... So I pulled up a string patch on my old cheesy keyboard, and I just put my hand down on the keys up high and made a cluster of notes very close to each other. It was very dissonant, and it totally transformed the scene. And in that moment, I felt like a superhero. I felt like I had storytelling superpowers. Like the power of music to transform a scene one way or another was so intoxicating that it was a really transformational moment for me. And it was kind of a moment for me when I thought, okay, this is something I can do for the rest of my life. It's that powerful a feeling. I want to give these students that feeling. I want them to experience what I experienced and to understand that, there's a world out there beyond pop music. There's a world out there beyond producing or beat making. And it's incredibly wonderful and rewarding world. If you work hard and have a little bit of luck, it can be a great way to make a living as well. So there's that side of it. Then there's the other side of it, which is once these composers have gone past those hurdles of realizing, yes, I want to be a film composer, they experience new hurdles, which is the institutional stereotyping that you indirectly alluded to by mentioning Pinar and Captain Marvel. She's the first female composer to score a major action film. Why is that? Well, it's because the institution of Hollywood has this fixed idea that female composers can only score stereotypically female type music. So that to me and many others in the industry, that might mean a family drama. Same thing with African-American composers. They ended up getting stereotyped into doing so-called urban thrillers or crime dramas with largely African-American casts. So I would like to try to give a leg up to these young composers from these disadvantaged groups early in their careers by subsidizing their scores for low-budget movies. So it's a very exciting time right now because I'm very close, maybe a month or two away from finalizing the formation of a nonprofit foundation, which is being funded by SESAC. And thank you to Aaron Collins at SESAC, who has been an invaluable partner in making this happen, where we're going to allow film productions who already have hired composers from these disadvantaged groups. These would be low-budget film productions that have limited music budgets. They can apply for grants, and on a case-by-case basis, we will subsidize their music production budgets. I would imagine most of the time it would be to hire musicians, to go to a low-budget orchestral recording hub, maybe in Eastern Europe, like in Prague, places like that, where you can hire an orchestra and a studio for a reasonable amount of money, and maybe we can buy a composer 2 days of orchestral recording for a score. Or if it's non-orchestral recording, money for specialized equipment rentals, or an engineer, a mixer. Composers are not always the best people to mix their own scores. Anything to improve the production value of the music specifically, that's a win-win for everybody. It's a win for the production, where they end up with a better quality score, and it lifts the entire production value. It's a win for the composer, who has now better music for their demo reels to get more and better projects in the future. And I think it's important to not only increase the pool of these composers in the industry by getting them early in high school, but also helping them to just get a little bit of a leg up once they've crossed the threshold into deciding to become a professional, and then they encounter some new walls that they need to clamber over.
Good change.
Thank you. I like your choice of words here. My foundation is called Key Change.
Ah, there you go. I was just going to say, Terrence Blanchard, who, told us that he told us on mic too, it's on the show, so I can say it, but he said he's had directors say, do you know how to score for orchestras?
This is, yeah, we can put this on mic if you want, because I would say one of the more, I want to say laughable, but it's actually not humorous, injustices in this industry is how I can walk into a room and sit down with a bunch of filmmakers and very convincingly tell them, yeah, I can do a hip-hop score for your African-American themed movie, and they take me 100% seriously. There's not a doubt in their mind that I could do that, but the reverse is not true, and that is really not fair, and that is, one of the things I'm trying to fight against.
Great. Let's do a couple of storyophonic questions, if we may. You came to music early, obviously called to it right away. Is there an alternate career, if you didn't do music, that you would be involved with?
Yes, I think I would be a computer programmer. That is what I studied in college because my dad made me for 3 years. And that was my summer job for a couple of years after. In fact, that is how I paid my rent. Once I moved to LA and started the USC film scoring program, when I had time, continuing to do work remotely for a small company that distributed pipe valves, and I became their IT department, and I was programming database software for them to keep track of their clients and sales and stuff like that. And I did that for about a year after I moved here. I find that getting lost in coding and debugging, it's not altogether that dissimilar from solving the puzzle of a musical piece. And, the feeling of getting lost in it and realizing, oh my God, 3 hours just went by, I have no idea where the time went, is a very similar headspace.
You alluded to this a little when we talked about the Peanuts movie, but the question being, how did the era when you grew up influence how you score films or how you hear sound?
I think I was just discussing this with a friend of mine the other day, actually. It's not a revelation or incredibly original to say that as artists, we are simply distilling our lifetime of artistic experience, in my case, all the listening that I've done my entire life. It's in my brain. It's all there jumbling around. And when I compose, all I'm doing is taking those elements and recombining them in a way that feels new to me and hopefully to other people who listen to it. Like I was saying with Vince Guaraldi listening to Styx, Depeche Mode. Depeche Mode is still touring. I went to the Hollywood Bowl a few years ago to listen to them, and after that concert, I felt like I need to take a cold shower because I was hearing idea after idea, songs I had forgotten existed. I'm like, oh crap, that's where I get that from. Oh no, that too. It was just like all these little turns of phrase and the way phrases repeat and develop. To me, I can just see so clearly how it all comes from 80s pop music. Even after 140 scores and after really consciously trying to continuously evolve and stretch my orchestral chops, I think at its core, I'm still a child of pop music. And I hear that in my work constantly, not only in the little turns of phrases I was describing, but also on a more macro level, the way I like to structure pieces. I appreciate a real clarity of structure in my work. If I'm sitting down to write a 2.5 minute cue, I really love it when I can have a very clear structure, like an A part, then a middle part, and then we can come back to the A part and maybe change a few things about it, the orchestration, the way the melody goes, because that gives you as a listener, a real sense of satisfaction coming back to that material in a new way. In fact, I can remember very specifically as a kid listening to pop music, and a lot of pop songs start off with the first verse. It may be very simple. Maybe it's just guitar and voice. And then when the chorus kicks in, everyone comes in, and you get to the second verse and everyone stays in. And it's so exciting to hear what you heard in the first verse now played, now the drums are playing, now the bass are playing, now the full arrangement is playing. It's like you look forward to that as a listener, that experience. And I realized what I'm going for when I structure my cues, whether it's an action cue or an emotional cue, is like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, out. Like it's just ingrained in my brain.
Since you now work as a mentor and you're working with the kids as you advised us, what do you tell them that they should listen to? Do you tell them to study, and if so, what do you tell them to study?
I'm a big believer in study, but I'm not necessarily a big believer in being classical study or film music study or anything in particular. I think anything that gets you inside music, gets you thinking critically about how music is made, constitutes excellent training as a musician. So what I would say is listen to what moves you and then try to figure out why it moves you. If you can read music, then transcribe it on paper. If you can't, then sit down at a piano and try to pick it by ear. But make an attempt to get inside the music and figure out, okay, now I know what I love about this particular part of this particular, typically for high school kids anyway, it would be pop music. About this particular pop song, it's this chord that moves to this chord in a kind of unexpected way, and it's beautiful, and it really gets me excited every time it comes to that part in the song. Once you internalize that and you understand almost from a musico-mathematical perspective why it works that way, then you can start incorporating that into your own work.
A personal question, if
Sure.
I may. You don't seem like you have a lot of spare time, but if you do, and when you do, and you're not working on initiatives, are there other things that interest you that you get to spend time with?
I'm sad to say that there aren't a lot of things that I love to do besides music. And when I'm not doing music, I like to kind of let my brain chill. So I tend to watch TV and hang out with my cat and hang out with my girlfriend. And, I don't really have any non-musical hobbies. I have a lot of musical. I love listening to music. When I have a free moment, I'll turn this guy on and play with the cables and the knobs. But that's basically it.
Chris, great to meet you early in your career when I did, and it's been so interesting to see your progression.
Still early, less early.
I was still early, but to see your progression to this point of having
Thank you.
such a great resume of work and such huge films now,
Thank you.
And you're always a joy to talk to. Christophe
you.
Beck.
You too.
Great pleasure to have you on Stereophonic.
My pleasure as well. Thank you.
You've been listening to Stereophonic, a regular podcast series with tips and tales from deep inside the music industry. We come to you from Datalight Studios in Los Angeles, California. Our show is produced and edited by Lindsay Tomasic. Our production manager is Kim Strand, and our theme music is by Dusty Gray. Please rate us on your favorite podcast platform, catch up with our past episodes, and visit us often for new shows. I'm your host, Dan Kimpel.